Thank you so much, and hello, good morning, good afternoon, evening, good night to everyone on the call. We have just had fibre installed in our office, and it was working brilliantly until about an hour ago. So please use the message system if you can't hear or see my my slides, so I'm not talking into a void.
So far, so
thank
good.
you so much for. Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to join the conversation today. I know that various people on the call or their organisations were actually participated, gave willingly of their time and thoughts for this study, which was actually completed almost 2 years ago. So I had to reread it to remember what we were talking about. And it's really interesting to see kind of what's changed since then. I should say from the start that I am not a researcher. I'm very much coming from the basis of practice and building evidence base. So I present this report with that proviso that it really came from the perspective of practice and an interest in looking at emergent practice. So I thought I would kind of touch on 5 things today. One is a little bit about the Global Fund for Community Foundations, the organisation that I work for, which I'm based in South Africa. We're a staff of 3, and we built up a network of around 200 organisations in 70 countries over the last decade. Talk a little bit about the people I wrote the report with, why the report was commissioned in the first place, because I think it's kind of interesting and it is very much speaks of a particular moment we're at. A little bit about the study and the conclusions, but also I thought it might be useful to share with you some of our thinking behind the report, some of our thinking out loud as we were conducting the report, because we really tried to challenge ourselves in reading, familiarizing ourselves with what's going on in the space of community-led development. And then just to finish, to say some of the things that are happening moving forward, particularly from the space that community philanthropy is sort of engaging in. So let me change slide. So as I said, the Global Fund for Community Foundations is a small organisation with a global network. And I suppose for the purposes of this group, our brief theory of change is around community philanthropy. That is an emphasis on local assets and local resources as a pillar or cornerstone of a people-led development paradigm that can shift power. And we are very sort of upfront in, I think, sharing John's critique of the system, that something needs to change. And over the last 13 years, we've really tried to lead by supporting the emergence of community philanthropy as a practice, as a way of working, as a set of values, as a set of organizations around the world, but also trying to influence donor dialogues, spaces where power and decision-making sits. So we've done a lot of writing. More recently, we've used the hashtag Shift the Power, really as a call for thinking about power at every level of the system, wherever it sits. So coming back to this report, you know, we come at this with a particular angle, I think it's fair to say. So my 2 co-authors in the report, Barry Knight and Susan Wilkinson Maposa, also both deeply sort of steeped in asset-based approaches to development. Barry Knight wrote a book on poverty in the UK recently, which was really very much the messages around the importance of people and relationships, often over money. And Susan Wilkinson Maposa did some groundbreaking work, probably more than 10 years ago, this series of publications called The Poor Philanthropist, which was based on some detailed studies of patterns of giving and reciprocity in Southern Africa. So I want to acknowledge them because probably most of the clever thoughts in the report are from then, and maybe I just added the sentences together in places. So the origins of the report, these pictures which are about to pop on your screen when your screen changes. I want to locate, there we go, this report in the context of a series of conversations facilitated, prompted by Civicus, that many of you will know, but other actors starting about 3 years ago to hold a series of conversations around rethinking sort of the development paradigm, but specifically around the issue of civil society resourcing. And I think that the idea that funders needed to do things differently, the world was changing, there was an emergence of new ways of working from the grassroots up, and that funders realized that they could actually help shape the architecture of development by their actions and where and how they located their funding. So this was a meeting that Civicus convened in South Africa 2 years ago. It was the second such meeting, which was really kind of going back to well, what needs to happen? Where are the gaps? What don't we know? And Comic Relief, which is a UK-based funder with an average annual budget spend of around £65 million, is one of a number of funders in the UK, including the National Lottery Community Fund, another big funder that also funds domestically in the UK. So funders that were trying to do things differently. And part of their rethink was to challenge themselves to say, do we have to fund, do we have to deliver all our work through INGOs, or are we missing something here? So I think it's important that for you to understand that this report came out of a set of conversations and a sense that there was an opportunity to explore something.
Excuse me, Jenny. Some of
Yes.
our folks are not English first language people. If you could just slow down a bit, they will be able to follow better.
I'm trying to speak slowly.
Thank
It's
you.
a challenge for me as much for them to understand me. I saw the note. So the study, it's 41 pages. You can read the full thing, so I'm not going to get too sort of stuck into it today. The focus of the study was to look at what was going on in the system. You know, what is the landscape for community-led solutions? What does it look like? Where are some of the bright spots? What is happening in the system? And what is the funding environment for this? What are some of the wisdoms or assumptions or new interests in different parts of the funding ecosystem, both from bilateral funders and in the space of private philanthropy? And the data sources we used was a lot of literature reviews and a series of key informant interviews, and these are all listed in the report. But one thing I think it's important for me to say is that we deliberately scoured some of the grey literature. So our sense and our experience as an organisation that has tried to grow an evidence base and commission data and research is that there's a lot of practitioner-led literature out there, but a lot of it was not sort of permeating the system, if you like, because it wasn't peer-reviewed. So we almost had a deliberate tilt towards making sure we looked at as much of the grey, non-peer-reviewed literature as we did the peer-reviewed stuff. Let me change the slide. So this was a short time frame to do the research, a pretty small budget, and of course what came up immediately were loads of questions around, you know, root causes, questions to do with accountability, were asset-based approaches part of a neoliberal pushback, what was the role of experts in a community-led paradigm? So there was a lot of stuff, and it was quite a challenge for us to sort of organize some of our thinking around this. So I'm going to give you a sense of some of the key conclusions of the report. So basically, the first one was that there is a renewed interest, it seems, in different places in the donor ecosystem, particularly on trying to think about questions of resourcing and effectiveness. And I think to some extent, these have been forced upon funders because of the changing environment we are living in. So the shrinking space is having an effect on how donors fund and where they can fund, and questions around the extent to which external funding can undermine the legitimacy of local civil society. I think that's one big area. I think we're seeing the emergence of a number of countries moving into middle income status. And so donors' behaviors are changing, they're retreating, etc. And of course, the ongoing question of how many more decades of doing development do there need to be before we reach anything like sustainability. So I think there is a sort of a moment where new conversations are happening and there is a new interest in questions around power. There's been a lot of interest in the shift the power notion amongst within the donor community, or certain parts of it. So that's sort of on the design, if one is thinking about from a systems lens, on the design side of the system, so the sort of the institutions, the structures of the kind of funding agencies and the development architecture we have, some thinking there. But also on the emergent side of the system, that there was evidence of new ways of working, new kinds of thought leadership, new interest in looking at how actions at a very local level, which maybe represent some profound mindset shift or behavior change, how does one start to think about aggregating those in a sort of movement of community-led development? How does one see that? How does one understand that? And then how does one join it up to create a global sort of movement based on solidarity and kind of cross-fertilization of energies and exchange? And one of the ideas we sort of proposed in the report was this idea of community-led 2.0, which was looking at a lot of the community-led literature that had gone before, but with the addition of helping communities to create assets. And here we're assuming a lens of an asset-based approach, in that communities have assets and they could be, relationships, knowledge, insights, etc. But we were looking at the particular interest on building new institutional forms, governance structures, that could steward money. What happens when communities have their own resources and bring them to the table? So that was one piece of it. And I think another piece that was important as well was around success being the strength and thickness of relationships and networks and trust. And so some of these things that are quite difficult to measure and to capture. So very much looking at an ecosystem lens. And then sort of our kind of rather sobering conclusion overall was that right now the incentives aren't in the system to encourage people to think or work differently. I was talking to a colleague from the Kenya Community Development Foundation this morning about something else, and she was describing a year-long project funded by a donor, and the purpose of the project was to build a school, but the real purpose was to unlock community resources, to get the community to realize that if they started to contribute, it created relationships, stronger relationships and trust within that community, which that could translate into a sort of social muscle that might help them to claim their rights. Well, that took 9 months of a 12-month project. So they're only just getting started when the project finishes. So those kinds of disconnects. So those are some of the conclusions of the report. And you can read the report at your leisure, I'm sure. Great bedtime reading for you. But I thought it would be useful to look at the questions that were informing our learning journey as we went on this research. And there were 7 questions. You know, is community-led a good idea? I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about 1, 3, and 6. So we'll just look quickly at 2. You know, can you do community-led development if you have a sectoral lens? Is that too narrow? And some of the feedback we got in the report was communities don't operate in sectors. There is a holistic view where different things are joined up together. So it was a struggle to fit sector-based, issue-based projects into a community-led approach, because there was a sort of mismatch of fit there, if you like. Questions around, you know, new approaches and new partners. If we keep using the same, this is number 4, if we keep using the same models, institutions, structures, ways of working, can we change anything? And if we can't, who's missing? Who's not at the table? There was a lot of discussion. I think this has become an increasingly important conversation in the last couple of years in the development sector more broadly, around you know, the importance of an ecosystem lens. So can you do community-led development if the ecosystem is not supportive of that? And what does it take to create a supportive ecosystem that can see community-led initiatives as part of something that really drives the engine of development rather than that exists at the margins? And then the 7th one was around language. And I think you see this on Twitter almost every day. Someone will say, I object to the use of the word beneficiaries, and there's a great discussion about why beneficiaries is the wrong word, and an agreement that we have to change our language. And yet there are some learnt behaviours when we, as a sector, apply for our own funding. There tends to be a reversion to a language which is power laden. There are donors and there are beneficiaries and there are recipients. And that really, can you change anything if the language consistently doesn't really support the values of the work? So drilling down on the 3 I had identified, our first question was community-led, is it a good idea? And you know, the 3 of us came at this very much from a sense of course it's a good idea. But when we started to review parts of the literature, the evidence base is quite mixed. And partly that is because people are defining community-driven, community-led, people-led in different ways. And also probably because if you're only looking through the lens of a short-term project, can you see what happened after the project ended? So there were all sorts of questions around that. But actually, the evidence base is not all singing in favour of community-led approaches. So for those of us who believe with evidence, the challenge is, I think probably goes back to John's point earlier about how one starts to measure and aggregate data to make that case, is an important piece of this. Another observation was that there was an increasing interest in community-led development in academia and in research. Here in South Africa, there's a new chair on African philanthropy that has been established, so that some of these new developments that are starting to look from the lens of academia around how a community-led approach, what it looks like, what it means, what constitutes community-led, is one development. I'd mentioned before this growing interest amongst certain donors, and that's sometimes reflected in starting to use language around community philanthropy, community asset building, local resource mobilization as part of a piece of a community-led development paradigm, but also increasing instances, I would say, of some of these donors starting to say, we don't want to fund big organizations anymore if they continue to work the way that they have worked traditionally. And the final point, is that community-led is not universally celebrated, and there are quite a few critiques of it. I mentioned earlier, some of the critiques of asset-based community development, which sort of see that as is that a way of taking the state off the hook when the citizens should be claiming their rights? They shouldn't be trying to organize their own resources. So things like that. Question number 3, the old chestnut around scale, which is, can you really line up scale and community-led development? And I think this was one of the conversations in the key informant interviews we did, where this kept on hitting a dead end, which is scale is a design question. It's a design side of the system issue. International NGOs want scale, foundations want scale, bilaterals want scale, but actually your notion of scale, you on the system side, is not necessarily shared or understood for those organizations and movements who are working more around sort of horizontal mobilizing. So scale maybe needs to be understood differently, such as in the context of networked scale rather than perhaps institutional scale. And then the last one I'll mention was actually who is leading this renewed interest in community-led development. Our assumption was that it's coming from grassroots, that people want this. And it was very interesting to see that much of the literature and writing and the push is still coming from the design side of the system, the institutions, the donors, organized development, and that it is still, there are few spaces or limited visibility of voices from the field being present in some of these conversations. And there was a couple of people actually said, we don't spend our time going to conferences and presenting papers. We don't have the time or the resources to invest in these questions. I'm sure if we did, we could tell you exactly what we thought. And a few people also helped ensure that this report got published, because originally it was meant to be an internal document. They said, we won't participate unless something comes out of it that helps move our agenda forward. So I think there is a sort of sense that somehow the importance of weaving in voices from grassroots, from the global south, as owners of this agenda is a really important piece of this puzzle if it's going to happen effectively. So I'm just coming to the end here. I'm going to put back on, that was me talking about, as somebody who did the research, was involved in the research for the report. And I just wanted to share with you some of the things that we're seeing sort of emerging out of processes like this. And certainly producing the report, it generated a lot of interest, and it made us realize that we need more bridging literature that puts together different pieces of the puzzle. So theory, academia, emergent practice, emergent theory, what are the messages, what are the messengers, and how do we unlock more effectively pathways of sharing of knowledge and information in a flatter, power flattened way, more effectively than perhaps the system is able to do at the moment. So I just wanted to highlight a few things that are sort of emerging on our horizons, which may be of interest to this group. And some of these are referenced in this report. The Global Alliance for Community Philanthropy, which was mentioned in the report, is a really good example of what happens when funders come together and shine a light on something and say it matters. That there is a role that donor power can play in saying something matters. Sometimes that's more effective than somebody far away outside on the edges of the system saying something that mattered. And this alliance was a mixture of bilateral and private donors. So it involved USAID, the Inter-American Foundation, the Aga Khan Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Ford Foundation, and Charles Stewart Mott Foundation. And it was a super interesting space to start looking at this question of people-led, community philanthropy, and understanding the particular lenses that different donor institutions either do see the world through or are forced to see the world through, and to try and understand what some of the kind of channels of information that work, that advance community-led development, but also tick the boxes, the donor requirements on the sort of more vertical side of the system as well. So I think more of those sort of honest learning and sharing spaces. The beauty of this one was all the funders put in a small amount of money for 5 years each, so it wasn't a huge cost, so they could afford to be a bit experimental. We've seen conversations around Shift the Power, oops, sorry, I've jumped ahead, happening all around the world. Both there was a session at the Bond conference. Bond is the UK network of international NGOs, looking at the sort of so what for INGOs, how do INGOs think about, what can they do differently? Obviously, and particularly in the UK, it's a massive issue around the hashtag #AidTo, hashtag #MeToo, general sense of drop in public trust towards large international NGOs at the moment. But we've also seen Shift the Power conversations sort of gaining traction at a local level. And John mentioned the Zambia Governance Foundation, which has become quite active in sort of owning this agenda and shaping it from the context in which it sits. And then the last thing I want to mention, and this draft manifesto, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, is something that we as the Global Fund are taking forward, which was to start clarifying our ask. What is it we want? What is it we don't want? And one of the main sort of frameworks that we are excited by is to break out of some of the bounds of international development as the way we understand our work, which invariably ends up being about flows of money, towards something like a good society. What is the society we want to live in? And not only is that a more kind of creative and imaginative framing, in that it allows people to imagine, there's also something about starting to organize community-led initiatives both in the global north and the global south, and be more effective in joining them up. I think certainly in the UK, and probably no doubt in the US at the moment, that recent political and economic events have actually resulted in all sorts of really interesting examples of community organizing happening outside the system. Communities, citizens taking their own agency and organizing themselves. And how can we get better at kind of decolonizing this thing about being global north, global south, and move towards something more around global solidarity? So my last slide is just to tell you about this event that we're planning in November in the UK, a relatively small event, but trying to build on some of the data and findings from the report in terms of starting to look at evidence, both from the sort of big theoretical academic stuff, but also kind of create pipelines of data and evidence from the emergent side of things, from practice, and start to try and locate it in a broader shared framework of a people-led development paradigm. So that's the end of what I was going to say today. So I'll hand back over to you, John.
Oh, wonderful. We'll leave your slides up for a few moments in case people have specific questions that causes you to flip back. Let me just see in the room. Any questions or comments here in our room? Yes, Rebecca.
I'll start us off. Thank you, Jenny, for the presentation. It was really interesting. Oh, sorry. I'll try to speak slower. So I was really interested in the finding that community-led development is fundamentally a language or a framing that makes sense to Northern donors and to Northern Global North organizations, and that your findings were that it was something that didn't have a lot of relevance. I was wondering if you could really dig into that a little bit more, because obviously it's a theoretical framing, and I feel like that's something that can be fundamentally sort of foreign, or it can be more the domain of people who sort of go to these conferences and do that kind of round of framing. But I was wondering, because my on the ground experience has been that people often will express sentiments that lend themselves towards this kind of framing, even if they're not putting it together as a whole package. So I was curious, if you could tell a little bit more about those reactions and why you would say that it's something that's maybe even rejected by the people that you work with for the study.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it was rejected. I would say this is the bread and butter of what a lot of grassroots organizations are doing. It's a no-brainer, and they're constantly frustrated and challenged at having to explain it to other actors. So they tend to look for funding that doesn't do that, that just gets it. I would say that the sort of advocacy and articulation is largely being done by more Northern actors, the making the case. And that probably, in order to really kind of build this out in a system, the system needs to have the patience to listen, the resources to help people articulate things. So much of our work is in English. What are we missing? Are we translating not just literally, but culturally, conceptually, a lot of these ideas, which, as you say, are so obvious to many people working on the ground that you don't need to go to conferences to talk about it. And I think, so my sense is that the pushback, the fact that a lot of this advocacy is being led by actors in the North is because many of us are located in a position where we can see what's wrong with the development system, and that the accountability needs of the development system have created something that's not community-led. So I'm not saying there's not a mismatch. It's just we need to get better at creating really joined up pathways that feed from the bottom up and from the top down in ways that kind of move the whole center of gravity towards communities. And sometimes we, and I include myself in this, we fast track in the articulation of it without having really gone back and thought about how can we make this even better and richer if we can bring people at the community level along with us, but create an environment where this is an enabling framework for them, not an extractive one. So don't give us the evidence so I can go and present a report, but what would enable you to tell your story in a way that improves your work and convinces others. And I think it's a sort of almost like it's a tiredness and a lack of intentional investment in creating those pipelines, those pathways in a more, there's a power and a resource dynamic here that we have to acknowledge. And until we start kind of really intentionally building out that other side in a way that people find enabling, I think it's just a sort of a fact of where we are at the moment more than anything.
Hi, Jenny. This is Sam from AJWS, American Jewish World Service. We support a lot of small grassroots organizations in 19 countries around the world. And I think one thing that we've noticed is that more and more our partners are actually rejecting funding from those larger organizations that are putting certain demands on them or pigeonholing them or forcing them to do work that they don't feel comfortable doing. And so we applaud them for rejecting the funds. And I think what we're trying to do more and more of is really lead them in funder advocacy so that they can prove their programmatic worth, so that larger organizations feel like they can go there. One question I had for you is really, a lot of this to me seems to be about comfort with risk, right? These larger funders who say, you know, I don't want to take the risk, and how to go about convincing them that it actually is a risk worth taking. So that's something I wanted to know if you explored in your report. And the other question is, I lost something you said at the very end about, I believe you said a UK-based conference, and then I lost you, but I'm not sure if I misheard that.
Oh, yes. Okay. So, hello. I think we probably work with many partners who are similar in terms of their sort of approach. On your first point, I think there is an opportunity when CSOs, when grassroots organizations start rejecting funding. Unfortunately, at the moment, it is like a leaf falling from a tree in a forest. It does not having the kind of ripple effect that it should have, which is kind of, wow, people are saying no. And I've been involved in many conversations, particularly in Africa, about, you know, organizations saying, well, shall we go on strike? Shall we have a donor strike? And we all agree to turn down funding. So I think there's an opportunity, and one of the ways we've been thinking about this is, how do we start thinking about this as a movement and as a sort of shared purpose? And it's not just about our organization. So if you don't get money, I might. If you're saying no to a funder, it might create something for me. How do we exercise movement generosity in this? And how do we start to shine a light on some of these radical statements, which are inherently sort of political and challenging power? I think as a system, we don't do that well, and we could do better, because, as you say, the examples are there for the taking, and they should be held up. That is power. I think the donor advocacy that you were mentioning, risk. Yeah, I can't remember actually if we talked about. I think it was implicit throughout, is this notion of risk. And what we've tried to do, and I think there is a space for organizations working, you know, for those who want to work better, to find out what are the main arguments, what are the blockages that stop this. And risk is clearly one, and accountability, and So what is the evidence? What are the arguments we can collect to start pushing that back? And then how can those, you know, a couple of funders who have that power, old power, because they've got money, start kind of imbuing a system with some of those messages? And we have been quite intentional as the Global Fund for Community Foundations to really try and highlight good donor practices, to say, you know, this is kind of, it's nonsense to say that this is a barrier. You're doing it the wrong way. Try this kind of thing. And I think that I think that's the opportunity that I'm seeing at the moment, is actually you can give a funder exactly the same peace of mind, even with better outcomes, if you frame it differently and they use their resources differently. And how we kind of actively gather that and engage in this sort of funder advocacy. What we've noticed, interestingly for us, when we were just talking about community philanthropy, because development is so siloed, it was the easiest thing in the world for funders to say, oh, we don't do that. When we started using the hashtag Shift the Power, it created both a bit of a carrot and a stick. And we have found that has allowed us to get into conversations that we weren't previously privy to, because there is like, who doesn't want to be the funder that's shifting power? Who wants to be the funder that everyone says you're not shifting power? So I think we've also got to be strategic and tactical, as well as deeply authentic in our work about the messages, you know, what's the message and who are the messengers? And I really think that, you know, platforms like this and others that are out there, you know, Edge Funders, Human Rights Funders Network, are places where we can really challenge ourselves to be much more strategic about how we articulate what to whom.
That's wonderful, Jenny. I think we have time for one more question if someone has one.
Oh, I was going to mention the event. It's on our website, www.globalfundcf.org. It's a symposium called Pathways to Power, and you can find out all about it there.
And we'll send that out as a reminder to everyone with the follow-up email. The other thing I promised to do in the follow-up email is before I send out the link to the recording, I will go back and I will stick the slides in where they should have been at the beginning, rather than repeating the first 15 minutes of this, so that when you get the recording, you can see where the slides should have been.
John, I have.
Yeah, Ritu?
Hi, Jenny.
Hey.
Hi, this is Ruchi. I am sorry I joined in late, and I'm from India and a Dalai Lama fellow. I'm also a sustainable urban development practitioner. So my question is coming from my past year as a Dalai Lama fellow working on cities and building children-led cities as my community. The question follows. Donors do operate from a very formal space, and there are a lot of innovations across the world germinating from young minds that are dancing with these systems and building on diversity of hearts and assets they operate in their communities. How can we flip and make sure that the donors and funding mechanisms support experimentation and dance with these young germinating systems?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question. And I think it really is, if one brings us, again, a systems perspective of this, is what is, how first can the system as it is see what you're talking about? Particularly, it's not good, funders often can't see things they can't fund. That's a blinker that they have. And sometimes you don't want funding, funding is the thing that destroys these things. So almost thinking about, sorry? Oh.
No, go ahead.
Thinking about how can we create not blockages in the system. So at the moment we have a system which is around intermediaries. So we send money from the sort of, it goes through a series of intermediaries and it's costly. How can we think about these layers in the system?
Yeah, sorry, there were people who had feedback, and I think they've now fixed it. But
Daily and Alexis, maybe, they are unmuted.
Yeah,
Sorry about that. My mic unmuted itself, I guess.
Yeah, I keep trying to mute Alexis and Adele, but I can't for some reason. Okay, please go ahead, Jenny.
Sorry. I think what I was saying is, I think we need to challenge ourselves to be much more imaginative. And instead of thinking about, how do I get donor funding from A to B, is how do I create a sort of series of connections and relationships where resources can arrive, the right kind of resources can arrive at a particular level on the right terms to make something happen. And how can those resources build on what's already there rather than destroy them? And I would say, youth-led action is one of those, there are patterns of somebody does something amazing, a donor says, I'll fund it, and it destroys it. So how do we as a system better understand what is organically led, bottom up, and when it wants to remain like that, how can it still sing in the system without having to have funding to legitimize its existence? And for those who have the appetite to say, we were started on this voluntarism, this energy, this creativity, but we actually see the opportunities to both grow out horizontally within our community and with our community, but also we have our eye on power and on engaging vertically up the system. So advocating with funders, being heard, changing the way that things are, and how do we get funders to move from the I love the turn of phrase that the Nonprofit Finance Fund in New York uses to move from buying services or outcomes to build or buy. Let's do more building of the right kinds of things in the way that can do what they need to do best, and less buying of outcomes and things.
That's well said.